Great. So earlier this morning you talked about Senate reform and how you don't think it's a key issue when discussing different subjects today. Why not, and what subjects do you think we should be discussing?
So we actually do think Senate reform is a key issue worth discussing. I think what you're mentioning is the notwithstanding clause. So we don't think the notwithstanding clause is viable to pass, especially in the situation that we're in, because of the 7+50 rule. So you need to have 7 provinces with at least 50% of Canadians' population in order to pass, which, considering Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, BC, well, with the exception of BC, have passed, have used the notwithstanding clause in the last 20 years, we think it's highly unlikely that they will agree. And of course, they hold large population centers for Canada.
And of course, on the issue of Senate reform, you also need to pass those same thresholds in order to pass that kind of reform on the Senate. And in addition to that, we just think that it's not a massive issue because the Senate doesn't affect most people in their day-to-day lives, and so there's more materially pressing issues that are directly affecting Canadians that we think could be more usefully had time spent on.
Okay. Another question. So we know that you, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories have formed a bit of an alliance. What are you planning on using that alliance to push?
So definitely the alliance isn't necessarily something that we're pushing. It's just great to have someone, especially considering the territories I would say have been forgotten, especially historically, and you can see some examples at the conference. I mean, a lot of the things that we're voting on, territories don't even have the chance to vote on because we are not in the Constitution of Canada. So I think it's good just to have the support from their premiers. I haven't really spoken with Northwest Territories as much because obviously they haven't really been present at a lot of our meetings. We haven't been able to get in contact with them until right now. So, but I think having them with us kind of just reaffirms a lot of our positions.
Great. All right. What benefits do you think that you could gain from having more immigrants coming into the Yukon with incentives like a 20% tax cut that the federal government has been pushing this afternoon?
Yeah, sure.
So, in terms of immigration, the Yukon is quite small. We have about 40,000 people in the territory, and so skilled workers are really an issue that we care a lot about because there just aren't that many people in the Yukon and there isn't that much education facilities in the Yukon. And so immigrants often come in with lots of skills or are trainable to do things. And so if we have more people, then more tax revenue, more people to do jobs in the territory, and just generally like helping the economy in order to flourish with more people, and also just having a welcoming atmosphere. Like, it's very important to us to accept people from all around the world and all around Canada who can help make Yukon better.
Are you concerned that if Yukon does have more immigrants, they'll all just end up in larger population pockets like in Whitehorse? Or are you going to incentivize them to spread elsewhere across the territory?
I think that's a concern that's been a problem in a few places. So for instance, across Canada, the hubs for immigration are obviously Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, maybe those sort of metropolitan centers. And it is definitely a concern that that might be reproduced within the Yukon, where everybody goes into the city and nobody lives in rural areas. So yeah, I think we would definitely consider making some incentives for people to live in rural communities, and just more generally making more investments into rural communities in the Yukon to make them more livable.
Where would you get the funding to provide those incentives?
That's a good question, and obviously I don't have all the numbers on that, but our immigration ministers have been talking with the federal immigration ministers for more federal funding on immigration, and some of that might be diverted towards routing immigrants towards rural areas. And of course, as a territorial government within the Yukon, the Yukon's government has some funds that it can apportion to that sort of issue.
Okay, one more question. How do you plan to create more jobs without destroying and harming the natural resources and natural beauty of the Yukon?
So obviously the Yukon is a territory built on mining, at least historically. Obviously, as we as a country and as a world shift away from fossil fuels, we want to make sure that Yukoners can keep their jobs while also maintaining the natural beauty of Canada, but specifically Yukon. So with the federal government has proposed a nuclear energy expansion that we are opposed to, but we would like to see expansion in tidal, solar and wind power, which would build more jobs that would replace the mining industry.
In addition, in the mining industry in the Yukon, there are obviously ways to make that more sustainable and more responsible for the environment. And so there are ways that those jobs can be preserved without harming the Yukon's natural beauty and the environment as a whole.
Okay, if you're planning on diverting more funds towards cleaner energy, like you mentioned, would that be in raising taxes, or would that be moving funds from one sector to that sector?
Well, we expect that in general we will be receiving some federal funding in terms of renewable energy, just because that's a fairly large priority for the federal government. We're hoping that the federal government accepts to not divert that only to nuclear power and allows us to build out hydro, wind, tidal, solar, and all of those other more renewable sources of energy other than nuclear. But there's also the issue, just in the Yukon, we have budgets for energy, and a significant portion of that budget, I'm not going to say too much because I believe about 90-ish%, 90-odd%, 93 I think, of our energy is provided by renewable sources already. But that 7-ish% that is diverted towards fossil fuels, all of that money can leave that sector if we need it to. And so some of that might be moved around to pay for more renewable energy.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.